Hola, buenos días a todos. Comenzamos con la jornada inaugural. Este año tenemos la suerte de tener con nosotros a Ionna Heath. Posiblemente todos la conocéis, es una médico de familia británica. Ha ejercido durante más de 35 años en una única consulta en un barrio deprimido de Londres y al final de su etapa profesional también asumió la presidencia del Royal College of General Practitioners. Ha escrito mucho y muy bien sobre todas las cuestiones que le preocupan, la medicalización de la vida, el sobrediagnóstico, profesionalismo, ética y el final de la vida. Y ha tenido una columna regular en el BMJ, ha publicado un libro que se titula Ayudar a morir y sigue publicando mucho. A principios de este año ha publicado una serie de artículos sobre el movimiento Right Care en el Lancet. Es una persona muy reflexiva, con una gran capacidad de análisis y esto yo creo que la ha convertido de alguna manera en un referente de la atención primaria, un poco en la referencia de esta medicina más humana, menos invasiva de la que hablábamos ahora, y también es un referente en la defensa de la atención primaria como el papel que tiene la atención primaria en la mejora de la salud de las sociedades. A pesar de que hace algún tiempo que no ejerce como médico de familia, es muy activa y ayer por la noche nos comentaba que venía de París, que solo se podía quedar hasta hoy porque mañana tiene otro compromiso en Londres y confesaba que es que le cuesta mucho decir que no. Nosotros estamos muy contentos de que no haya sabido decir que no, que esté aquí con nosotros y ahora nos hablará de lo que ella llama el arte de no hacer nada. Es posiblemente algo más fácil de decir que hacer. Y compartirá con nosotros su visión sobre este tema. Ha hecho una presentación con muchas referencias literarias y que ha titulado, no sé si es una buena traducción, Atención sanitaria razonable, hacer o no hacer, que esa es la cuestión.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for such a kind introduction. It's an enormous privilege for me to be here today, so thank you for the invitation. Right now, in the 21st century, we who live in the rich countries of the world have the enormous good fortune to be living longer and healthier lives than ever before in human history. And yet, while we have clearly understood that too little medical care can harm health, our societies have not yet learned that too much medicine can also be harmful to individuals, to societies, and to the planet. So, reasonable care, to do or not to do. Reasonable is an interesting word in English. Firstly, it obviously implies being rational and logical and based on sound judgment. But when we say be reasonable, we are asking people not to ask for too much, which seems intensely relevant to many of the issues of waste and futility within contemporary healthcare. This is the great American writer Saul Bellow. And in his novel, Mr. Samler's Planet, Bellow describes seeing the singular human creature demand more when the sum of human facts could not yield more. This demand is not reasonable and applies to both patients and their doctors. Everyone seems to want to demand more than the facts will yield. And Bellow goes on to ask, do we always to the point of misery, do a thing? Persist until exhausted? Perhaps. And it seems to me that our hope for a better and more caring medicine, especially towards the end of life, depends on this perhaps. The remainder of my title, To Do or Not to Do, clearly refers back to William Shakespeare and to his great play Hamlet, written in 1601. This is the British actor Benedict Cumberbatch in a recent London production, and my title evokes his great speech from Act 3. To be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. Should he kill his uncle Claudius, or because he cannot be absolutely sure that his uncle is guilty of his father's murder, should he commit suicide? Here my point is that this whole speech is very carefully reasoned and demonstrates the importance of very careful thought when making difficult decisions. So to do or not to do demands careful thought, perhaps above all in clinical medicine. We need to think very carefully about the degree to which we are all attempting to apply biotechnical solutions to the profound existential problems of finding meaning in the face of the human inevitabilities of suffering, loss, and death. Pharmacopoeia is a medical art collaboration between the artists Susie Freeman and David Critchley and the family doctor Liz Lee. And in 2003, Pharmacopoeia were commissioned to produce Cradle to Grave, which is a 14 meters long, it's huge, installation in the British Museum. Its central theme is the dominance of the biomedical approach to health and illness within Western societies, here focused mainly on the use of medication. 2 central pill diaries made out of pocket-knitted fabric document and reveal all the medicines prescribed to one typical woman and one typical man during their lifetime in the UK today. Both contain over 14,000 drugs, which is the current estimated average prescribed to every man and woman in the UK in their lifetime. And it should be emphasised that these are only the prescribed medications. So over-the-counter medicines or pills such as vitamins or minerals are not included. The artists used contemporary prescribing data to create a composite everyman, here on the left, from the real medical prescribing record of 4 different males, and an every woman on the right from 4 different females. Introducing their work, the artists wrote this: "In the end, we are asked to consider the deeply complex relationship we have with prescription drugs. They are both wonderful and dangerous. They allow us to live longer. They allow us to suffer less. But they may also offer false promises of happiness and health and immortality that they cannot possibly deliver. In this, they are more like the spirits and gods of other cultures than we care to believe." The website related to this artwork is fascinating. This is a diagram of the first part of the male pill diary, and this is the number of pills the average man takes from birth to 40 years old. Birth to 40 years old. You can't see, but the yellow is antibiotics, for example. And then this comes from the end of the man's pill diary, and the same number of pills covers only 2 years, from 73 to 75, culminating in this man's death from a stroke. And this illustrates just how much prescribing goes on at the end of life, with all the attendant risks of drug interactions, side effects, waste, and futility. Bioethicist Daniel Callahan describes the extent to which the 1% of patients who consume some 21% of healthcare costs, usually succumbing gradually from multi-organ failure, illustrate the progress problem. 50 years ago, they would have died faster and in many cases with less suffering. We have traded off shorter lives and faster deaths for just the opposite, longer lives and slower death. This is Ezekiel Emanuel, American oncologist, bioethicist, and previously health advisor to Barack Obama. And he wrote this article in Atlantic Monthly in 2014, Why I Hope to Die at 75. Once I have lived to 75, my approach to healthcare will completely change. I won't actively end my life, but I won't try to prolong it either. There seems to me to be enormous wisdom in this resolution. And I find myself comforted. I mean, I'm not 75 yet, but I'm closer than most of you. And I think that if I make it to 75, then I won't ever have to have chemotherapy. Now, isn't that a comforting thought? That actually, if you're not actively seeking to prolong your life, you can forego such luxuries as chemotherapy. I'm looking forward to making it. Too much medicine has become a slogan that describes the increasingly obvious problem within contemporary medicine, particularly, but by no means exclusively in rich countries. It is just one manifestation of the overconsumption so prevalent in our time, but it is perhaps the most relevant to us as healthcare practitioners. Too much medicine often begins with overdiagnosis. Overdiagnosis occurs when illnesses are diagnosed which, if they had remained undiagnosed, would never have caused patients harm, with the consequence that patients are exposed to unnecessary treatments for which risks outweigh benefits. But this is only the starting point of an unfolding problem with global implications. Take the World Health Organization as an example. We are taking more pharmaceutical medication than ever before in human history, and in this context, I had high hopes for this campaign, Medication Without Harm, which was launched earlier this year. But sadly, this campaign is only about prescribing and dispensing errors. Every person around the world will at some point in their life take medicines to prevent or treat illness. However, medicines do sometimes cause serious harm if taken incorrectly, monitored insufficiently, or as the result of an error, accident, or communication problems. Nothing at all about overdiagnosis or overtreatment or the rising rate of pharmaceutical consumption. Much of it useful, but much of it wasteful, and much of it harmful. These are... Has the mic on? No, it's okay. Sorry. These are the estimated pharmaceutical sales for last year in American billions. These are huge sums. Absolutely stunningly huge. Evaluate Pharma describes itself as an organization that provides senior decision makers within the pharmaceutical industry with models of the sector from the viewpoint of the world's financial markets. It's not my natural reading matter. This is their report from last year, which contains these upbeat headlines. This year's world preview shows worldwide prescription sales are forecast to show annual compound growth of 6.3% between 2016 and 2022. Expanding waistlines across the globe are helping to prop up sales of anti-diabetic drugs. The therapy area is set to grow 7% annually by 2022. No wonder there's so much pressure on GPs to identify asymptomatic type 2 diabetes as a disease rather than the risk factor that it is. This is the graph showing the predicted compound annual growth rate from 2016 to 2022. The frightening implication is that these profits depend entirely on us all being persuaded to take an enormous and rapidly increasing number of medications. This represents what has been called the pharmaceuticalization of society, defined as the transformation of human conditions, capabilities, and capacities into opportunities for pharmaceutical intervention. Disease used to be regarded as a misfortune, but now it is seen as an opportunity for profit. Health used to be seen as a blessing, but now it too has become an opportunity for profit. Global Data plc is another one of these organizations, and this one describes its mission as being to help our clients decode the future to be more successful and innovative. And the healthcare section of its current website carries yet more cheerful headlines. North America elbow replacement market to hit $29.5 million by 2023. The cystic fibrosis market will rocket to $7.6 million by 2025 as drugs improve. South Korea will be the fastest growing digit replacement market to 2023. So now you know. And this is what happens when neoliberal economics meets healthcare. Back in 2010, Global Data was highlighting one particularly contentious disease condition, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which I think will be mentioned again later. This is from a paper published in 2014. Global Data estimates that the global ADHD market was valued at $3,855.6 million in 2010 and is forecast to grow at a compound annual growth rate of 8% over the next 8 years to reach $7,114.5 million by 2018. My point is that this commercial imperative can only be realized if more and more children are diagnosed with ADHD and prescribed treatment every year, which is certainly happening. But the big question is how much this will prove to be in the interests of these children. What do we teach children with the label and the treatment of ADHD? They learn that they are not normal, that they are not responsible for their own behavior, and that the answer to their problems comes in a bottle. So what lies behind all these optimistic profit predictions? Factors include the pressures of neoliberal capitalism, the commercial imperatives of the pharma industry, the seductive power of the new and of technology, and guidelines-based pay for performance. I'm not going to say much about the first two because the story is well known, except to remind you of the clear evidence that a range of inducements from pharmaceutical manufacturers have been shown to impact on physician prescribing behavior, even though physicians are typically unaware that their behavior is altered by these incentives. You need to tell me whether pharmacists and pharmacologists are subject to similar pressures. But I do want to talk about this. We all have a tendency to be seduced by technology and the new, and the smartphones in all of our pockets demonstrate just how much these have to offer. But look again at the famous innovation adoption curve. I'm pretty sure that we have all been taught this or something similar more or less recently. Think about the, I've got a pointer. Think about the value judgments. No, it doesn't have the value judgments on your left-hand side. I can never tell my right from my left. The value judgments inherent in the terms enthusiasts and visionaries. Who doesn't want to be an enthusiast and a visionary? At the leading edge of the curve, and about the ways in which these have been used to drive the introduction and diffusion of new prescription drugs and new technologies. And whenever I see this innovation adoption curve, I remember Vioxx and the corruption of so much pharma-sponsored science and the huge number of medications we are now prescribing for the frail old. And I want this T-shirt. I'm proud to be a laggard. I want to be on the trailing edge of the innovation adoption curve. I'm not interested in being a visionary. I learnt the reason for wanting to be a laggard decades ago from a diagram in this textbook entitled Oscillations in the Development of a Drug. I have never forgotten it, and it went something like this. Another one of his fool ideas, he's a crackpot. Gee, it's wonderful, it's simple, cheap, and cures magically. Death from agranulocytosis, it's a poison, I wouldn't give it to a dog. Used carefully in selected cases, it is the best therapy for such and such disease. Here is a much more recent version of precisely the same diagram, this time relating to the introduction of a technology, renal denervation for the treatment of resistant hypertension. In the case of renal denervation, it took only 5 years to move from point A, with the publication of early trials in the Lancet in 2009, to B in 2014, when the sham-controlled trial showed minimal benefit. But in the meantime, in those 5 years, Medtronic paid $800 million to acquire the company that developed the technology, and at least 8,000 procedures were performed out with the US, in Europe and the rest of the world, and probably many more. My point is that if you are a laggard, if you have my T-shirt, you have a chance of entering the field after the oscillations have settled, so causing less harm to patients, saving huge sums of money, and perhaps being kinder to the planet. Pharmaceuticals are biotechnologies, and our abilities to produce and use technologies appear to outrun our abilities to reflect on their application. We risk becoming technological titans but ethical Lilliputians, technologically brilliant but insufficiently thoughtful, with a tendency to do before we really think. This is Wendell E. Berry, novelist, poet, environmental activist, cultural critic, and farmer. In 2012, he gave the prestigious US Jefferson Lecture, and he said this: "The problem that ought to concern us, first, is the fairly recent dismantling of our old understanding and acceptance of human limits. For a long time, we knew that we were not and could never be as gods. We knew or retained the capacity to learn that our intelligence could get us into trouble that it could not get us out of. We were intelligent enough to know that our intelligence, like our world, is limited. We seem to have known and feared the possibility of irreparable damage. But beginning in science and engineering and continuing by imitation into other disciplines, we have progressed to the belief that humans are intelligent enough, or soon will be, to transcend all limits and to forestall or correct all bad results of the misuse of intelligence. Upon this belief rests the further belief that we can have economic growth without limit. And also the further belief that death is somehow now a failure of medical care, rather than the inevitable culmination of every human life. So far, so bad, but recent developments in what is called P4 system medicine, P4 standing for predictive, preventive, personalized, and participatory, which sound good but are not, seem about to make things considerably worse rather than better by massively extending mechanistic reductionism in the name of systems biology. This recent paper from Henrik Vogt and colleagues from Norway dissects this possibility. P4SM represents a techno-scientific holism resulting from an altered, more all-encompassing technological gaze on human life and related changes in biomedicine's methods and philosophy. It is the epitome of technical rationality. This is the new nirvana. The tools of P4SM also enable continued hope that however complex, human wholes may yet be defined and controlled by science. And I wonder how many of you would like your human wholes to be defined and controlled by science. The Institute of Systems Biology in Seattle has recruited 100 people in good health, completely well people, for detailed longitudinal study as part of this project. And they report preliminary results from the ISB 100-person wellness project show how, this is the article say, show how expansive P4SM may become in labelling well people. The report says, so far, after having analysed just a few types of data, we've found that 100% of the 100 pioneers have multiple actionable possibilities. Every single well person was found to have these multiple actionable possibilities, was found to be in need of treatment, was no longer well. American family physician Raymond Downing summarizes the dystopia that this new techno-scientific holism is inflicting on medicine and on humanity. We are now in a phase beyond medicalization when even health, the opposite of medicine's focused disease, has become medicalized. Biomedicine, assuming it knows what health is, imposes that understanding on everyone. Medicine used to claim authority over the cracks and interruptions in life. Now it claims authority over the whole of life. Which brings us seamlessly to guidelines. This is the American economist J.K. Galbraith. He wrote, in the modern economic and political system, ideological identification represents an escape from unwelcome thought. The substitution of broad and banal formula for specific decision in the particular case. All too often, medicine's version of the broad and banal formula that allows us to escape from unwelcome thought is the evidence-based guideline. Sadly, the legacy of the well-intentioned emphasis on the evidence base of medicine has been the proliferation of these guidelines, which were designed to provide guidance, but abetted by a multitude of subtle pressures and the indiscriminate and distinctly unsubtle incentive of performance-related pay in many countries, you must tell me about here, have been slowly transformed into tablets of law that make it all too easy to do without pausing to think. This is Zygmunt Bauman, who was the Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Leeds. And he clearly demonstrates the false certainty of some medical prediction by surviving to the age of 91 despite his obvious love of tobacco. Bauman writes, to be responsible does not mean to follow the rules. It may often require us to disregard the rules or to act in a way the rules do not warrant. Only such responsibility makes the citizen into that basis on which we can build a human community resourceful and thoughtful enough to cope with the present challenges. And we undoubtedly need a healthcare community resourceful and thoughtful enough to cope with present challenges. So whenever appropriate, we must disregard the rules, disregard the broad and banal guideline, which does not quite fit this particular patient. Too much medicine is the result of a new beverage fallacy. To explain, in 1942, during the darkest days of the Second World War, Sir William Beveridge published his immensely influential report, which laid the foundations of the UK National Health Service. Beveridge envisaged a health service which will diminish disease by prevention and cure. Development of the service, and as a consequence of this development, a reduction in the number of cases requiring it. His hope was that providing universal access to healthcare for the first time, the health of the population would improve to such an extent that the costs of providing it would fall. Such was the initial Beveridge fallacy, and it unravelled very rapidly. The National Health Service was inaugurated on the 5th of July 1948, and already by the following February, the escalating costs of the service provoked a doctor to dismantle the faulty reasoning in an article in the British Medical Journal. All the official predictions are totally unreliable. There was a first. Because they ignore the effect of the ageing of the population, one, because they ignore the intrinsically expansile nature of hospital practice, and three, because they are based on a false conception of health and disease. All three of these accusations hold true today. In the context of his massive contribution to the creation of the National Health Service, Beveridge's optimism can certainly be forgiven, but the apparent naivety of contemporary politicians who repeat this mantra is much less acceptable. Dr. Roberts, the author of the critique, noted, in the 20th century, civilization is faced with a threat unique in its history, the existence of more ill health than it can afford, due not to any temporary calamity, but paradoxically to the advance of civilization itself. Society has opened a new Pandora's box, releasing new diseases of its own creation, and with them innumerable new methods of treating all the illnesses which it cannot cure. This was written nearly 70 years ago. We are still waiting for a political response that rises above the level of platitude. Medical science does not save lives, it defers death. No one lives forever, and on average, a quarter of a lifetime's costs of healthcare are incurred in the last year of life, whenever death occurs. Preventive healthcare, when it lengthens lives, exposes people to other health risks, and cannot reduce costs, whatever the level of political wishful thinking. As the American humorist H.L. Mencken put it, explanations exist. They have existed for all times, for there is always an easy solution to every problem, neat, plausible, and wrong. We have created a whirligig of greed, fear, wishful thinking, and vested interest, all of which are driving the medicalizing of society and the over-medicating of populations. As a direct result, we are harming individuals by labeling them as being at risk and causing unnecessary fear, which itself can undermine health and well-being. An emphasis on prevention is shifting attention from the sick to the well and from the poor to the rich. Too much medicine is rendering healthcare systems based on social solidarity unviable because of the escalating costs involved. And finally, biotechnical preventive activity marginalizes and obscures the socioeconomic causes of ill health. Science has not eradicated suffering, despite its enormous power to deliver technologies to improve health. Being more humble about the experience of individuals, rather than simply drawing up reductive report cards of their health status, opens up the possibility for a more realistic understanding of what it means to be healthy. The fact is that one cannot be healthy in an unhealthy society. We need to be much more humble in the face of human suffering and much more humble about our ability to predict the future. We need to be much less certain. Driven by the whirligig, the OECD countries consume more than 80% of the world's healthcare resources, but experience less than 10% of the world's disability-adjusted life years, which must be unsustainable in terms of both global justice and the world's resources. Overdiagnosis and undertreatment are the conjoined twins of modern medicine, both driven by the imperatives of corporate profit within the medical industrial complex. Prescribing may be the answer to undertreatment, but deprescribing is what we need in response to overdiagnosis and overtreatment. This is simpler than it looks. It's one of the many helpful algorithms being developed by the Canadians at deprescribing.org, and they look really useful to me. And to end, this is another artwork by Pharmacopoeia, this time a wedding dress containing contraceptive pills. And here it is used to illustrate the cover of a joint report from the Royal Pharmaceutical Society and the Royal College of General Practitioners in the UK. The recommendations of the report include the urgent need to engage patients better in discussion about risk and uncertainty, an understanding that a medicine review is about deprescribing as much as it is about prescribing, and is not so much a one-off event as an ongoing process over time, and recognition that increased interprofessional discussions are essential to managing polypharmacy. It seems to me that these will be vital to the future of care that is reasonable, alongside the imperative to think before we do. Thank you very much.
Tenemos tiempo para un par de preguntas. Si queréis, nos sentaremos aquí y podéis preguntar en castellano o en inglés, como queráis. Ella tendrá traducción.
Yes. Thank you very much.
¿Se oye bien? Sí. Bueno, muchas gracias a todos. No sé si hay alguien que tenga una pregunta. Por aquí Cristina levantaba la mano.
Bueno, enhorabuena por la excelente presentación. Yo tenía más, un comentario, una duda. Me ha llamado la atención al principio de su presentación la alusión al daño que puede hacer la medicalización de la vida o el too much medicine sobre el planeta, ¿no? Sobre los aspectos medioambientales. No es la primera vez que lo oigo, oía a Sir Murray hablar sobre esto, pero yo diría que, al menos aquí en España, no se habla mucho de los efectos de esto, del exceso de atención sanitaria sobre el planeta. Me gustaría que nos comentara. Sí, en el Reino Unido esto es algo que se comenta entre los profesionales sanitarios o entre la población en general, porque aquí no es tan común.
Well, I think it's very interesting because I think that those people who talk about overdiagnosis don't talk about the planet, and the people who talk about the planet seldom talk about pharmaceuticals. But there is data. Actually, the biggest producer of data was the Environmental Protection Agency that Trump has just emasculated. So that'll be the end of that data. But the pharmaceuticals are becoming more and more prevalent in the environment, in fish brought out of near Chicago. And then there was the big scandal of millions of vultures in India dying as a result of giving diclofenac to cows. And because you can't eat cows in India, they're left for the vultures to eat, and the vultures are totally sensitive to diclofenac, and so they died in vast numbers. And that's kind of the warning event, that if we keep on putting, because whether we take them or not, whether we take them or we flush them down the toilet without taking them, they end up in the environment. And I think the evidence of damage is slowly building. So it is another aspect of our responsibility. Thank you for raising it.
Thank you, Ionna, for your conference. I was wondering whether is the society really prepared for this reasonable care? I mean, I'm quite worried when I see the thoughts of many people just asking for more and more. So how can we translate this message to patients, friends, family, everyone, not only patients?
It's very interesting. I mean, from an anthropological point of view, as the artists did, we can look on all this medicalization as a way of fending off death, as previous generations have done in different ways, through religion, ritual, etc. But actually what we do is we give people pharmaceuticals, and when we do that, we actually invite them to consider their mortality. So we put them into a spiral of anxiety about their mortality. And I just think we have to keep explaining how limited the effectiveness is of too many of our medications. I know that I have nihilistic tendencies, but I was very ill 7 years ago and probably owe my life to the wonders of prednisolone. What a drug. Fantastic. So there are there are absolutely drugs that are essential, but there's so much on the edge. And I think the amount of medication we are giving old people is really shameful. As Victor Montori must have explained, the burden of having to remember all these different regimes when you can't even remember whether you put the kettle on is a disaster. And my experience is that certainly older people will help you. They don't actually want to take so many medications. They'd like you to tell you which are the 2 or 3 that they really should take, and which ones can they just leave behind. Very old people know that they're reaching the end of their lives. They're not in life's immortal period like many of this audience. And therefore they are much more realistic. But too often we as professionals don't give them the chance to be realistic.
¿Alguna pregunta más? No sé si veo a alguien allí. Al final, ¿no? Bueno, pues yo te haré Yo te haré una última pregunta y podemos cerrar el debate. Y es que en los últimos tiempos hemos visto la aparición de movimientos tipo Choosing Wisely. Aquí tenemos Esencial de Aguas, que lo conoces. También tenemos nuevas palabras en el vocabulario como de prescripción, que hace un tiempo no hablábamos de ello. ¿Podemos ser optimistas y pensar que todo está cambiando? ¿O hay razones para el optimismo?
I think there are huge reasons for optimism. I think we're almost reaching a tipping point, and I think politicians are finally getting the message that promising populations more and more medicine and more unrealistic hopes about what medicines can deliver. I think the message is finally coming through. There's the wonderful example of what she called the chief medical officer in Scotland, who tells this wonderful story about going to see an old man who had had a knee replacement and asking how he was. And he said the knee replacement was fine, but he still had the original problem. He'd gone to his doctor because he liked to stand on his front steps and chat to his neighbour. And he was finding it hard to stand long enough. And he wanted a railing that he could hold on to while he chatted to his neighbour. As a result of going to see his doctor, he didn't get a railing, he got a knee replacement, and he still hasn't got a railing. So he was not a happy customer. So I think so important to listen to what our patients' priorities are. Too often we do what we know how to do rather than what we need to do. And we know how to prescribe. We're very good at prescribing. It's not difficult.
Y finalmente, Ionna, tienes una sala que creo que todo el mundo está de acuerdo con lo que has dicho. Hay farmacéuticos, hay médicos de atención primaria, enfermeras, gestores. ¿Por dónde podemos empezar o qué deberíamos hacer primero?
I think all of us have a responsibility to talk to everybody about these issues. This will only be solved by enormous public debate about the limitations of medicine and it's what we're doing is the equivalent of making a sacrifice at the Temple of Hygeia in the Roman times. It's similarly effective if you take all these ridiculous number of medications. And it's time we stop deluding ourselves, and we need to have realistic conversations. And we need to reconcentrate health services onto those who are sick, those who are suffering now, and leave the well alone. This is my big slogan. Leave the well alone. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. Just don't go and see your doctor if you're feeling all right. Have an apple. Yeah, we done?
Thank you so much.